SECfans.com back again this year, going in our third season. We really missed y'all. We talked about that in the opener with Auburn and Washington. Going to remind y'all real quick, if you love what we're doing in here, please smash that subscribe button. We get, a pretty good, healthy number of views coming from search on YouTube. But if you want that notification every week to hear what we're talking about, and it's not always going to be about your team, but we're still talking about good stuff, statistics-driven channel. We get nerdy with you. You want to hear it, go ahead and subscribe, and you'll get that notification to know when we put stuff out. And that way we can talk about some stuff that's not just the game previews or reviews, maybe getting into some live discussions, some real in-game discussions and things like that. Okay, so now that we got the business out of the way, let's talk Alabama-Louisville. We've already talked about Auburn and Washington. We stepped outside of the SEC with Michigan and Notre Dame, and now we're going to talk about I don't want to say it's an under-the-radar kind of start for Alabama. It's not necessarily that marquee name matchup that they've had like a USC or a Michigan, but when they signed this deal with Louisville was actually a very consistent player, winning a lot of games, obviously put out a Heisman Trophy winner in this system for Petrino, and we don't know a whole lot about this Louisville team. We do know, in spite of a little bit of running one's mouth about the fact that Alabama DBs can't handle their wide receivers, they do have really good, talented wide receivers, which has been a staple for Louisville for a while. So what I want to talk about first, before we get into Alabama, before we get into the Tua versus Jalen debate, before we talk about any of that stuff, I want to talk about this notion that in a Petrino system, and we've seen this at stops along the way before he is where he is now, before he was where he is now. We've seen this sort of mindset, this mentality that it's next man up in Petrino's system. The next quarterback up, it doesn't really matter. They're interchangeable pieces, and whoever he rolls out there to play quarterback is going to put up 40 points a game, 400 and something yards a game off the total offense, and the other defense is just going to have to win a track meet. Is that necessarily true? And if so, what does that mean for Alabama? Or is that not true? And if it's not, talk about why you think that is.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that personally. Now, something we've talked about a lot in the show is how certain offenses fare in college versus certain types of defenses, how they operate, what they're required to be successful in. We talk a lot about how the run spread offenses or spread offenses in general that have propagated throughout college football are really good at winning 9 or 10 games, not really great at winning championships. That's been a running theme of ours for years. We were at times very critical of Alabama when they made the shift they made under Lane Kiffin, because we thought it was a really great scheme for them to make the playoff, and we thought it was a terrible scheme for them to win the playoff. And a lot of the criticisms that we've had off and on, criticisms we've had of the team under Jalen Hurts have been taken as criticisms of Jalen Hurts when they're really criticisms of the system. You flip that around, and we also have some similar opinions about the style of offense that Petrino runs, which is in some ways similar to concepts run by Kevin Sumlin and some other guys. That is a downfield passing offense with mini wide sets. And that's because that offense requires a lot of time to throw the ball. It requires a quarterback that can deliver the ball with velocity and accuracy down the football field. It requires tall receivers, just big targets. And we've kind of seen two things to be successful with it. One is you're going to have a dominant offensive line, a huge quarterback, and tall receivers, and run a true NFL-style passing attack. The other thing that can be successful is if you have a mobile quarterback that can buy time because the offensive line can't protect long enough. Kevin Sumlin in 2012 happened to have both because he had Johnny Manziel, who was an incredibly mobile quarterback, and then they have an offensive line that had, as it turned out, 3 first-round draft pick offensive tackles on the same line. It's just one of them was playing, I think, guard. So when you put those two things together, that type of offense is dominant. And the moment they lost those pieces, and I say this when I say dominant, I mean there was an Oklahoma game where Johnny Manziel had literally 8 seconds, I counted, in their bowl game before he had to leave the pocket. When that offensive line slowly left over a few years and they lost the mobile quarterback, Texas A&M imploded. And with Petrino and their offense, and they've had really great numbers. I mean, my first caveat is they've had really great numbers when they have all those pieces, when they can block long enough, we have the quarterback can execute those plays, and we saw that in the SEC. We also saw his offense at times really struggle in big games where they didn't have time to throw. And in particular, Petrino really struggled personally against Alabama because Alabama's defense usually was very fast, aggressive, and disruptive. And his teams had a really hard time executing their offense properly. So, I don't take it for granted that he can just reload and put a guy in. He's been really successful at times, but I also think it was partly due to the players he had. You look at, and we'll talk. I want you to circle back with me in a minute on this because you would kind of asked me to look at this a little bit, and I did my homework on Petrino and where he's been and how his teams were successful under him and how they did versus the coaches that replaced him. And I think a lot of it really has to do with the pieces he's had. And, and excuse me, his system may be really successful, and his system does leverage the talent to a large degree, but I think it also requires very particular pieces to be that successful. He just happens to normally have them.
And we've talked about already in a couple of shows this week that we've filmed about sometimes raw statistics or scoring numbers don't tell the whole story. Sometimes what we see against a lot of crappy defenses makes a perception of a complete player or a complete offense. But if we look even specifically with Lamar Jackson against SEC or SEC type defenses, he didn't fare that well. And, just looking at last year in his bowl game, so consecutive years in bowl games against SEC teams, he's been poor. They put up 9 whole points against LSU. He couldn't get the ball off. They were in his kitchen, and he couldn't really accommodate or compensate for that, and it really just shut him down. And then last year, he threw the ball 31 times, 5.5 yards per attempt. He put up 171 yards throwing the ball, 4 interceptions to two touchdowns, and then had a decent day running, 6.6 yards per carry. But they scored 27 points against a Mississippi State team that beat them 31-27, and Keaton Thompson actually put up a better performance against the Louisville defense. And you're going to say, okay, well, Mississippi State had a great defense last year. They're one of the top teams in the SEC West. But as a passing defense, they were actually not great at all. They were ranked in the 60s somewhere. So they got shredded. I think Jalen Hurts actually had a better game against them than Lamar Jackson did. So I don't want to kick the door open crushing Louisville as much as I want to say that it's not always what the perception is. Sometimes with these guys, they feast on lesser opponents. They have 1 or 2 games where they really step it up, but it's not necessarily against a great defense, and it sort of sets the perception of who they are. Whereas when they go to face a real defense, things change. That's not to say that they can't win this game. That just means that they might have to win it in a different fashion. They might have to find offense somewhere else and not just expect the guy to go out and throw for 350, regardless who it is, because it's Petrino's system.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lot of complications to it. The first is a lot of models right now are not doing a very good job of properly accounting for how offenses and defenses scale to the quality of their opponents. And what we mean by this is the same thing, and it's why I dredged up this whole discussion about spread offenses. Defenses don't respond linearly or don't respond the same way depending on scheme with who they play. In the NFL, where everybody runs a pro style and certainly the different schemes, but they're all, in large part, sort of the variations of the same concepts. You do see offenses sort of go up and down, at least to some degree, consistently with the defenses they're playing. In college football, teams run extremely different systems with a very, very different concepts and different things they emphasize. Whether it's the run spread or the really air raid style, heavy or vertical passing attacks, a lot of college football offenses are designed to exploit defense's inability to, one, rush the passer fast enough to shorten the amount of time the passer has to get rid of the ball, or two, their ability to move horizontally or vertically in space, particularly the run spread offenses, their ability to cover sideline to sideline, both in terms of reaction speed, how well the defense recognizes and reacts to the play, and as well as playing speed, how fast the defenders are able to close the gap, how fast they're able to get to the ball just in terms of sheer speed. As defensive quality increases, those style of offenses tend to be disproportionately effective. And when you look at Louisville's numbers, it gets kind of screwy because that style of offense, as we had in that long rant, tends to blow out teams that can't stay with them. Teams that can't handle that verticality, that especially teams that can't rush the passer at an elite level. They've just absolutely struggled with Petrino's style of offense. But those advantages start to go away, and you have to find other things to replace it. And sometimes they're able to. And Lamar Jackson was definitely a unique talent and was able to score in a lot of other ways, but he has a lot of other problems. And then the next thing that I'll talk on, mention really quickly with that, is Petrino's offense under at Louisville in the past several years has also been interesting because of how many possessions they get. And there was a game where Louisville played Syracuse recently. It was maybe 2 years ago. Yeah, 2016. And I use this as an example then in a video. And I'm judging enough now off the top of my head, to be honest. But in that game, Louisville's scoring percentage in terms of scoring drives, I believe it was 1 in 3. But regardless, I think they won that game, or Louisville Syracuse. They put up, I think, 56 points in the first half, something like that. And everybody was kind of going nuts over what they were able to do. How potent the offense was, how many points they scored, et cetera, et cetera. And if you just looked at the box score, it was crazy. The fact they put up that kind of point total in a game was nuts. But and it's a big but. The problem is they had 1 billion possessions. And looking at the first half, and I've got the box score now. So they scored 42 points in the first half, but they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 possessions in the game. And the thing I remarked is they scored 35 points in 11 possessions. And I think it was Vandy that week had a struggle bus win, supposedly, and they scored like 27 points or 24 points. And it's easy to say, well, they scored 62 and Vandy only scored 27. The problem is Vandy scored 27 points in 12 drives and Louisville scored 35 points in 11 drives. And so the offensive numbers in terms of, and this is especially why we don't use total yardage very much on this channel, it was really deceptive because they caused a lot of turnovers defensively that year. The defense was very aggressive. They forced a lot of 3 and outs. That was a part of it. And it's good for Louisville. But 2, the defense either scored really quickly on a big play or they went 3 and out. And that doesn't necessarily translate to production in terms of wins and losses, because if you give Alabama 11 drives or 12 drives in the first half, most of your defenders are going to be probably carted out in an ambulance by the middle of the third quarter.
It's interesting that you mentioned Louisville defense because, and again, Louisville fans are probably a little pissed off at this point because it feels like we're killing them, but we're a numbers-driven channel, and we try to look into the numbers to see, where you might have an advantage or a disadvantage, and we'll talk about an advantage in a second. In 5 losses last year, in their 5 losses, they gave up 41 points a game. Outside of Kentucky, Syracuse, and Virginia, who were just trash offenses last year, Louisville needed 30 points to win any other game they played. I guess they could have beaten Mississippi State with 28. That is, and I think that speaks a little bit to their offensive philosophy, where we talked about Shea Patterson earlier, having this kind of had a lot of turnovers. He had this gunslinger mentality because he knew he had to roll out a 40 spot if they had any prayer of winning the game. I think it speaks to Louisville's offensive philosophy a little bit too, where they will have these games where they put up a crazy number like they did against Florida State a couple of years ago, where everything's clicking, everything's humming, and they know they got to do that. Because if you look, the amount of pressure that you put on an offensive scheme, where in their 5 losses last year, they gave up 41 points a game. That's an astronomical number. In every other game, except for the very bottom of the barrel offenses they faced, they needed 30 points to win. That means you got to score 30 points before you even have a prayer of winning. That puts a lot of pressure on your offense.
Yeah, and actually this is a good place for me to bring up the stats I drew up with Petrino and where he'd been. So, looking at his different stops, right? I've always, and I apologize to Louisville fans, but and this is just true whether before he was at Louisville, I've always been a bit of a Petrino critic. And the reason for that is when he's left programs, he's tended to leave them in really rough shape. Now, some of that is due to the fact that he's being replaced by guys like Steve Cragthorpe and John L. Smith. And it's really hard to judge if Petrino is any good or not because, on one hand, he got replaced by guys who were terrible, and you can say, well, it's their fault. But the other flip side is, well, was it really their fault, or were there other issues too? We don't really know because the coaches were so bad, it kind of leads you to a disaster. But, and this is a big but, the offenses didn't actually fall off that much when those coaches left. So, looking at not this stop, but the last stop, the 2007, 2005 through 2007 time period, when Petrino was first leaving Louisville. In 2005, he had the second, looking at S&P metrics, okay? S&P plus offense, he was second nationally in 2005. His last year, 2006 at Louisville, he was second nationally. Steve Cragthorpe took over in 2007, still had Brian Braum as quarterback, and they were 8th nationally, but they went 6-6. And, you can look at it and you can say that, the coach mattered and a lot of other stuff mattered, but that offense was still good without Petrino, and a lot of it was probably was Petrino's system. I get that. I think a lot of it had to be credit given to Brian Braum. But the fact is it wasn't the offense that drug them down the next year. It was the fact that the defense couldn't keep up. And, they did crater the next year. And I note they cratered when they lost their receivers. I think it was Carter, Douglas, and Uridia all left in 2008. And the offense just cratered from 8th to 81st. But the thing I really wanted to note there is, the win-loss record fell off, not because the offense, but the win-loss record fell off because the defense fell off really precipitously. Flash forward when he was at Arkansas, 08, 40 came in, they were 45th nationally in offense, then 22nd. Then Ryan Mallett came in, they improved to 22nd. Mallett's senior year, they were 5th. Replaced him with Tyler Wilson, and they fell down to 10th nationally in S&P offense. So again, tracking kind of with the quality of the quarterback play pretty heavily. 2012, it was Tyler Wilson again. Now, this was, I think, around the time I started actually doing blogging before we did this show, and I had predicted that Arkansas was going to fall off a cliff that year, with or without Petrino, just because of the personnel losses in particular. They had 5 receivers with over 10 receptions. 4 of the 5, Adams, Wright, Greg, those guys were all gone, but they still, 2011, 10th nationally, 2012, 21st nationally. The problem was 2011, that was a 9-win team, right? In 2012, even though they were still 21st nationally in offense, they went 4-8 with John L. Smith. Again, the fall off wasn't offensive, and an offensive fall off did happen years later, but the immediate fall off was defensive. That has been a pattern with Petrino's teams, that he builds up really low-ranked recruiting guys, takes a lot of freshmen, plays them a lot, and builds them year after year. They get experience, and he ends up with a really senior-laden team, that the 2006 team at Louisville, or, the 2010, 2011 teams at Arkansas were like that. Not really highly talented guys, but guys with a ton of experience in their system. And he's more or less left right when he had massive turnover on the defensive side of the ball, and that has been his Achilles heel. And I say that because I think that's kind of what we just saw at Louisville. He was there when he had that defensive turnover. We kind of saw that, in my view, what I always thought was going to happen with Petrino, which is there's no way you can survive that and operate at a really high level. And so, to your point with numbers, maybe numbers not telling the whole story and a lot of other things, Petrino's always had success offensively. But they, his failure, or the failures of his teams when he left, wasn't because they lost his ability to be an offensive genius. They fell off because the defense couldn't keep pace.
And let's talk about Alabama for a little bit. I know there's a little more I want to discuss from Louisville standpoint, especially the wide receiver. I think Dez is really good, so I do want to talk about him a little bit. But there's obviously we need to touch on the quarterback decision that's coming up for Nick Saban. I would argue that he made the decision a while back. He doesn't tell the media or the fans his decision about quarterback. He never has. This is not new. This whole win the team thing. He says that every year. It's an out that he gives himself because it's ambiguous enough and intangible enough that he doesn't. There's no metric for that. There's no metric for winning the team, which means he can keep it in his back pocket and just throw that answer out there anytime somebody asks him the question. And basically, it's saying, "Piss off, you'll find out our first offensive drive of the season," because it's not whoever performs best in this scrimmage or at this point. So anyway, we had a long discussion about Jalen Hurts and Tua way back. After the national championship game, during the offseason, we had a long discussion. I would refer y'all to that because I don't think a lot has changed in terms of what the expectations are, what the reality is. The only thing that's changed is the 4-game redshirt rule that I would argue, if I'm Jalen Hurts, I would ask to only play in 4 games this year so I can preserve a year, because I think he knows, based on just the body language, the tenor of his discussions, he knows that he's moving on, I think, after this season. I do think he's in it right now for this team. I don't doubt that one bit, but I also don't think he is here for the long haul because Tua, I think, is going to be the man going forward. So let's discuss a little bit about what we think we'll see in terms of quarterback in this game. Me first, I think Jalen actually starts the game as an honor nod from Nick Saban. He starts the game, and that they have a package for him that he'll play meaningful minutes in this game and other games throughout the year where it's not just mop-up duty, but it's still Tua's team. What do you think?
It's tough. Personally, I actually think Tua is going to end up getting the start. And I think Saban would be apt to go the route you're talking about, where he wants to give Jalen, you call it the honor nod, but it's the consistency nod. In these openers, Saban has pretty consistently led with a quarterback that has more experience, and he's more or less tried to get through game one. And he's done this with quarterbacks, receivers, running backs, probably more with other players at other positions than he has with quarterbacks a lot of times, I think. But, a good example of this would be Calvin Ridley is a freshman. Calvin Ridley didn't get a whole heck of a lot of playing time in the 2015 opener. Calvin Ridley got a lot of playing time by the Georgia game that year. And I think it's more of you're relying on experience issue, and he starts really playing around with who needs to be the starter in game 2 and game 3 and game 4. And he just kind of wants to get through the opener as consistently as possible because there's just so many moving pieces and so many things are disjointed. All that said about what Saban's tendency is, I just think Tua is that good. I mean, I really think Tua is a likely future NFL starting quarterback, and it's kind of bizarre to see that at Alabama. I think Jalen is a quite good quarterback. I think Jalen could win a lot of games this year. I think Jalen could get Alabama to the playoff this year as the starting quarterback. It's just that Tua is kind of on a different level, and I just don't think they're going to be able to ignore that.
All right, and real quick, let's take just a quick beat and talk about the criticism that some in the media are putting out there because Tua is a Heisman contender, quote unquote, in the preseason, and everybody's rolling their eyes like this guy's not even started a game at Alabama. This is absolutely ridiculous. And I would argue that the people that are criticizing this it's lazy journalism, just like journalists, AP voters who vote teams really high because they're 12-0, 11-1, who say UCF deserved a national championship, because it's very surface level discussion. What has been always will be. A 12-0 team is an elite team. Well, until Notre Dame 2012 undefeated, gets blown out. I think they're doing the same thing with Tua. instead of taking a step back and looking at his game tape from last year and knowing the weapons he has around him, that it's feasible for him to win a Heisman Trophy. I want you to talk about that for a minute. Am I crazy, or is there something to this lazy journalism concept, or is it something else with them being critical of the people that are putting Tua as an early season Heisman favorite?
It's an interesting term to say it's lazy journalism. I think it's maybe to a certain degree, I would say it's short-sighted journalism. And I do think Tua has to be considered not just a legitimate Heisman candidate, but perhaps the leading Heisman candidate nationally this year. I know Vegas, and you bring this up, and we'd had discussions offline about this, and I looked at it, and I think right now Tua is the leading candidate on Vegas to be a Heisman, to win the Heisman Trophy, even though he doesn't get represented that way a lot of times in the media. I mean, she certainly talked about as if he's a Heisman guy, but we're still discussing whether he's even going to be the starting quarterback. That's unclear. But if you go back and look at and this is where I think you say lazy, maybe disingenuous journalism. In the last 11 years, so this is dating back to Tim Tebow, 6 of the past 11 Heisman winners have been freshmen or sophomores. 6 of 11.
And that's back to what I was saying before, where I think it was outside of Herschel Walker, I think it was, we'd never had any non-junior or senior win the Heisman Trophy. So I think it's some of that old mentality, old thinking, which to me is lazy, but maybe it's just semantics.
Yeah. I mean, either way you look at it, if you look at recent trends, young players win the Heisman at a really good clip. And most of these guys, that 6'11" guys, most of them were second-year players, right? I mean, Johnny Manziel was a redshirt freshman. Jameis Winston was a redshirt freshman. Mark Ingram was a true sophomore. Lamar Jackson was a true sophomore. And what most of these guys had in common is we all knew they had a lot of potential. Manziel probably came out of nowhere more than any of them, but particularly Winston, we knew had a lot of potential. And I think it's really prescient in this discussion with Louisville, because Louisville fans saw Lamar Jackson come in, not really know the offense, play a lot of meaningful snaps as a freshman, and knew there was a lot of hype behind him as a sophomore, knew what his capabilities were, and he came out and won the Heisman Trophy. And considering how often we've seen this happen in the past 11 years, and a lot of this is due because these guys are playing, it's a 3-year, these guys are 3-year players. We're in an era where 3-year players are extremely common. Most players aren't going to play more than 3 years. It just, it should be obvious that it's a really good chance it's gonna be a guy like Tua, because the truth is he's probably only got one more year to play anyway. When you combine that with the fact that Alabama has at this point, of their starting receivers, 2 of the 3 starting receivers are 5-star players, depending on if you could say maybe more than that. So basically, you've got the number 1 receiver overall, I think, in Judy, like the number 1 or number 2 athlete in Ruggs, and then the third guy caught the touchdown pass in the national title. And their talent level at receiver and the skill positions at Alabama is just absolutely absurd. So yeah, I think it's extremely lazy to count him out of the Heisman discussion, especially again, it's a trend that players in his position have won the Heisman every single year.
I think it's because everybody's like, he hasn't even started a game, but it's funny because they say he hasn't started a game, and so we don't know how he'll handle the pressure, and that's when I just like the like what face on my face when I hear that. Like, there is no more pressure than coming off the bench, bullpenning the national championship game down by 2 touchdowns. But anyway, let's discuss a little bit about those wide receivers, because what I think is interesting is there's a guy you're pretty high on that, if we're talking about jumping the gun a little bit, there's a guy you're pretty high on that hasn't even played a down of college football that might be starting over one of these crazy good, talented freshmen from last year, now sophomores, for this Alabama football team.
I assume you're talking about maybe
absolutely
Jalen
Waddle. I'm talking about Jalen Waddle.
Yeah, so Waddle, a receiver, I was really high on him, basically from the gun. But everything I've heard about this guy coming out of the spring is that he was an explosive receiver. I went back and looked at some high school tape of him, and I was confused at why he was ranked at where he was, because he was pretty well dominant from everything I could tell. And I did have somebody sort of tell me, and you look in the, um, you just go look in the news in Alabama football, and the rumors out of camp have been that he's been pretty dominant. I think the kid's truly special, and what's notable about him is most college offenses really need a slot guy that is an explosive, quick, fast twitch player. And the NFL certainly uses it a lot too in the short passing game. The New England Patriots have sort of patented the nameless, faceless receiver that you put in the slot, have him run for 6 yards and turn around. But in college, those kinds of guys, really what they end up doing is exploiting the fact that people don't read and react as fast, getting back to that whole discussion. And they make use of space and gaps in space to create big plays. So, I do think Waddle is a real impact player. I think you're going to see him play a lot of meaningful minutes. I can't say that he's going to basically take over the game, because Alabama has so many weapons, frankly, that they're going to have a hard time spreading the ball around effectively. But, to your point, I think this also drives home why I think Tua ends up having to be the guy, because they've got so much talent at receiver. If they don't have somebody that focuses on that, they're going to be leaving a lot on the table.
Yeah, we saw some frustration last year from Alabama wide receivers. Calvin Ridley, Cam Sims on the field frustrated when they're running free and they just weren't getting the ball. They weren't getting looks. Waddle is interesting to me in this offense specifically, or for this team specifically, because Nick Saban, outside of maybe Mays a few years ago, Nick Saban's really never had that really quick twitch, super fast slot guy, Percy Harvin style slot guy that's a complete change of pace from the big NFL outside wide receivers like Julio and Amari Cooper. Like, he's not really had that guy. So it's interesting from a dynamic standpoint to have that, as well as a really talented running game. Before we get into that, though, I want to say for Alabama fans that aren't familiar with Louisville at all, Dez Fitzpatrick is going to be the best receiver on the field Saturday night, in my opinion. And he didn't have a monster season statistically last year because, kind of in that offense, that Petrino offense, the quarterback is sort of the hero, and the wide receivers, you never know. It's kind of like the Saints, where people don't always love playing New Orleans Saints wide receivers in fantasy because they can have a monster week or they can have a nothing week. It just depends on who's got the hot hand. Dez Fitzpatrick is that kind of guy, in my opinion, in this offense that he might not have a monster game Saturday night, but he very well could, and I think he's going to be the best wide receiver on the field. Okay, so running backs, Alabama loses Bo Scarborough, who's actually had a pretty good NFL camp this year, maybe underscoring why Saban was determined to go to him as the second running back behind Damian Harris, who is, by the way, still the most underrated player in college football history. The guy averages over 7 yards per carry, and he's going into his junior season in the SEC. That's crazy, crazy, crazy. Nobody wants to talk about it. But behind him, obviously we've got Najee Harris. We saw him playing well in the national championship game, and he talked in the offseason a little bit frustrated, came in as a 5-star freshman, didn't get a lot of minutes. But I might say pause on Najee Harris being the guy at number 2, because you've got Jacobs, who, if he can stay healthy, is also that change of pace back and does really well catching the ball out of the backfield. Do you think there's a chance we might see Josh Jacobs at that number 2 slot, or is it Harris for the rest of the year?
I definitely think there's a chance you see Jacobs at the number 2 slot. When he got meaningful minutes in Alabama's offense, he was extremely effective last year. And we talked about that a lot. And there were times it was kind of intriguing, because I think somewhere around the middle of the year, maybe it was around their Tennessee game last year, you started to see Harris and Jacobs in the backfield together at the same time in a 2-back set. And then Jacobs got some sort of mysterious injury. Personally, I'm suspicious that he had something like a sports hernia, because he kind of slowed down. They had very few reps with him, and they kind of managed him. That's usually what happens with injuries like that. Regardless what the deal was, he kind of clearly they started putting him on a pitch count for the rest of the year. But he was a very, very effective player for Alabama. And they tried to get him more involved later in the year, and I think he hurt his foot again. Like they got him more involved in their Mercer game, and then he hurt his foot again and got knocked out. And the flip side to it is, it maybe this discussion sort of takes care of itself because Najee Harris has been banged up with a sprained ankle for much of fall camp. And I know I checked the news. It looked like on Friday he went back to practice, and he's expected to play in the game. But given the depth at running back, it wouldn't shock me if he doesn't get major minutes. And Jacobs is the number 2 guy, and honestly, I could see it being whoever's the healthier of the two. And then of course they've got Brian Robinson, who a bit like Kenyon Drake a few years ago, is that sort of forgotten 4-star running back that by himself would be a starting running back on most teams, and he's running 4-string right now, kind of waiting for his opportunity.
Switching over to defense, I think if there is a place that Louisville can take advantage of Alabama, obviously it's going to be their offense against the Alabama defense. And I don't know that there's a lot of questions, as there is every year, and this is something, I'm not going to rant about this, but it is funny that every year Alabama loses a lot of players in the NFL, and everybody says, well, they lost X number of starters. And this is something I'm going to want you to talk about a little bit to sort of fill people in on how this is a bit of a misnomer. But they always say Alabama lost X number of starters, they're going to suck this year, or they're really going to have a hard time refilling those roles and those reps and those minutes and that production. Talk about how, if at all, how that is kind of misleading in the Alabama defensive scheme specifically, and talk about how that relates to this year's team on the defensive side of the ball.
So there's sort of 2 parts to this, and the first is I think Alabama, I want to say it's like 11 or 12 players, and I say or I'm hedging because it's never really clear how many returning starters there are because of how you label it, but they never have more than 11 or 12 returning starters, and they've always been in the bottom quarter of, or quartile, bottom 25% of college football and returning starters for the past 7 years under Nick Saban. That's what happens when you have a ton of 3-year players. They're not usually going to be ready to play as a freshman, which means they start playing as a sophomore or a junior. If they start playing as a sophomore or junior, they play 1 to 2 years before they go to the NFL. The problem with that is, and there was a video, we like to do our analysis and make all our notes, and then sometimes I'll be curious to see how that jives with things. I always make my predictions and notes, and then I'll go check and see what the Vegas line is, just out of curiosity to see if I'm in line or out of line with it, so we can have the discussion. But I did see one spot talking about, and I'm not going to call the program or the video out that said it, saying, well, but even though Alabama's never had more than X number of returning starters anyway, they've always had at least 5 returning starters on defense. And this year they don't have that. They only have, 2 or 3 I'm looking at, I will call out, because it's in print, Athlon's magazine list Alabama as having 3 returning starters on defense. This year in particular, that's just not accurate. And I don't know how exactly they count returning starters and if they have a hard way of counting it. But last year, Alabama's defense, I'm sure Alabama fans are aware of it, and maybe Louisville fans are, maybe you're not, was decimated by injury. They opened with Florida State, and they lost, I think, 2 or 3 linebackers in that Florida State game. And at one point, and it was that Mississippi State game and the Auburn game where they struggled against Mississippi State, lost to Auburn. Alabama was down 7 of 8, and they're too deep at linebacker. Then they lost a starting safety. Minka Fitzpatrick played in the championship game with a torn groin. They were just beat up to heck everywhere on the field. The flip side of that is that meant that they played all kinds of guys on defense, and it wasn't just like spot play here and there. A lot of those guys played, the whole playoff. And an example of that is, if you look at returning starters, and I'm looking at Athlon magazine, they list Alabama's returning Isaiah Buggs, Raekwon Davis, and Anthony Jennings. Okay. But if you go down the list, the other starters on defense, one is Terrell Lewis, who, by the way, is now injured for the season again anyway. But Terrell Lewis started, or with Anthony Jennings, co-started the Florida State game to start last year. So he was a returning starter, played all throughout the playoffs and was a rotational starter. His backup, Christian Miller, was the guy that he was rotating with. That was a planned starter for all of last season with Anthony Jennings and Lewis. Mac Wilson, they have listed as not being a returning starter. Mac Wilson started when Sean Dion Hamilton went down against LSU. So he started the past, I think, 6 games of the season at Alabama and was already rotating in their nickel package for most of the year. Dylan Moses also came in around the same time period due to injury. So he played 5 or 6 games through the end of the year. Both those guys, by the way, played through the entirety of the playoffs for Alabama.
Yeah, the pick 6 against Clemson was it was at first Mac Williams, but ended up being Mac Wilson. That's an inside joke for people who remember the call in that game.
Right, and then at strong safety, Deontay Thompson is listed as a new player, and he started the last 3 games or so of the season. So the point being, if you actually count this list from Athlon and you highlight the guys I named, so we go from 3 returning starters, right, to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of 11 starters. So 7 out of 11 players, not 3, 7 out of 11 players on Alabama's defense started at least 3 games last season, right? So it's just such a, well, I think it's 2. Thompson only started 2 and everybody else started at least 3.
And he was actually quite the upgrade from who he replaced, but that's another story for another day.
Right. So the idea that Alabama doesn't return all these starters is, it's not just the normal Alabama reloads statement. This year, it's just not really factually accurate. They just had a lot of guys that missed a lot of time due to injury. And you're either not counting the guys that missed most of the season due to injury on one hand, or on the other hand, you're not counting the guys that replaced them. So it's a little crazy. And yeah, I even saw on a Louisville message board, I think somebody had posted that there were, Alabama starting 2 freshmen in the secondary and they only have 3 returning starters. And it's kind of, you do all this research and you see that perceptions are out there. And in this case, the perceptions founded on the fact that people actually did their research and they read Athlon's preview. And the fact is, in my view, Athlon's preview is just very inaccurate.
It's interesting you mentioned the secondary because I think that's where I want to go next. One of the guys you didn't even mention, Shane Carter, played a ton last year also, and he's probably going to be there. I don't know if he's not going to be an outside CB starter, but he's going to play a lot of minutes in this game, especially in their nickel and dime sets. But the 2 main corners that have yet to be decided are going to be tested and are going to be new. And facing a Louisville defense, if there's a place you see where Louisville can really exploit this defense, is it those new corners? I think Diggs is really coming on, and he's going to be a good player this year. I actually think he's going to be one of the starters. But given the fact that this is the first time that we're kind of throwing these guys out there, if you're Nick Saban, you're saying, all right, we're putting these guys out there for the first time, and oh, by the way, you got to face a Petrino offense. Is that a place where you can see that that's going to be a problem?
Well, I definitely think it's an area that's definitely the biggest area of concern for Alabama, and it's an area where I expect Louisville to have some success. Trayvon Diggs got pulled early in the season. He started the Florida State game. Again, one of those starters that isn't a starter. And then he was replaced by a guy that was a walk-on, but it was a walk-on that ended up being a borderline NFL player. And Levi Wallace, who's a really good story in his own right, but that's a different discussion. And he didn't know the position. It's for Louisville fans, interestingly, it's Stephon Diggs' little brother. And he was a converted receiver, 2 corner, learning the position, clearly didn't quite know what he was doing, didn't play with great technique. I've read where Saban has actually said that he's the one guy really locked into starting in that corner rotation, but he got burned pretty badly in Alabama's spring game 2 years ago in particular. He got burned by Florida State a few times in the opener, hence why I got pulled. So I think it's still a question mark, though it seems like he's really solidified himself, and that certainly happened with Alabama's corners and in particular because he asked so much of them that they often really struggle until they get things together. But definitely the other guys, there's a big pool of players Alabama's trying to pick somebody from Shaim Carter started or played the second half of the Georgia game. They pulled Tony Brown, was one of their starting nickelbacks. I always kind of found it interesting. The commentators didn't pick up on the fact that Alabama had pulled one of their starting defenders and replaced him with another player halfway through the national title.
Yeah, they pulled a guy that had an interception on the first play of the game.
Right. Yeah. He had the interception, and then he's the guy that gave up that 90-yard touchdown pass to Georgia to let them pull ahead by basically blowing coverage on that play. But point being that Carter almost certainly is going to play a good number of snaps, and clearly they relied on him if they played him for half a national title. But behind that, you've got a lot of guys that haven't played any minutes, and even those guys haven't played together. I think the safeties are excellent from everything I've read and heard. But I definitely think, especially considering how good Louisville's receivers are, assuming the quarterback comes out to play and assuming he has time to throw, and he probably even then they're going to hit a couple big plays where they're going to, Petrino's certainly not afraid to throw the ball vertically and take some deep shots and just see if your guys can play man on man and high jump the ball.
All right, so getting away a little bit from personnel discussion and more back in this game real quick before we go into our predictions. I'm curious your thoughts on if Louisville wins this game. We're talking about how many points they gave up last year. Defensively, they struggled. We know how Alabama scores against weaker defenses, even with Jalen Hurts at quarterback. That's not even accounting for the Tua factor in this one. If we wake up Sunday morning and we see the headline that Louisville won this game, how many points did they score?
I think if Louisville wins this game, you mentioned earlier, and we've had a long segment, but it's a big opener. It's Louisville had to score at least 34 points last year, right? By and large, to win a ball game. So you think Louisville needs to score 35 to 40 realistically to beat Alabama in this game?
Yeah, I think so too. I think 40 is their number. I don't think that's a realistic expectation for Louisville in the opener. So, Petrino's come out twice now and said that they're going to go out and win this game. And I don't really think that's bulletin board material. I think I like it. And I'm not generally a guy that likes trash talk or anything like that. I don't see it as trash talk. I see it as a guy putting his faith behind his players when everybody's telling them they're going to get their brains beat in or whatever the media is saying, whatever other people are saying. He's stepping up for his players and saying, you know what? Don't count us out. I don't think that it's fair to say that Alabama's automatically going to win this game. I think our predictions might show otherwise, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't come out and say, you know what? We're going to win this game. We can win this game. We got the personnel to do it. I think 40 is the number, and I don't think they get anywhere near that. And that's not a slight on Louisville. Really, nobody scores 40 on Alabama. When it happens, it's happened very rarely. I think, the most recent being Deshaun Watson putting up a number. They don't have Deshaun Watson back there at quarterback, and they don't have a situation where I don't think you can talk about how many plays and how many drives they got. They're not going to get that against a fresh Alabama defense, although a little bit thin at linebacker. So I'm going to go ahead and give my prediction. I think Alabama wins this game. I think we see more Jalen Hurts than a lot of Alabama fans want to say or want to see. I think we see him in meaningful minutes. I still think it's Tua's team, and this is kind of the opener of the Tua era. And I think because Jalen and Tua will play, and we've seen this with Nick Saban where he doesn't like to run the score up, but he does want to give his other quarterbacks meaningful reps, meaning he doesn't just run it up the middle if he gets a lead. He lets them throw the ball. Because he wants to give both of them the opportunity to play, I think we're going to see a higher score than we normally would have. I also think Louisville's going to take advantage of the new corners a little bit, and they're going to score more than Alabama normally gives up. Louisville fans, this is where I probably lose you. I've got Alabama winning this one 49-17. What do you think?
Okay, that's an interesting number. So first, I'll throw out my two kind of wild cards on behalf of Louisville. The first wild card is we may see as many as 6 transfers play defense for Louisville, and that could be really good. It could be really bad. We don't really know. The truth is, when you get those guys, you never really know how they turn out. And I think the bad thing is in week one, they're not going to have played very many, reps together. They're not going to play games together. But the defense could be a good deal better than maybe we're expecting due to all the transfers that are going to play on their team. The second thing is Louisville's had a lot of closed practices, and there's a chance that we see some significant wrinkles or retooling from Louisville that we're not expecting. Jawan Pass is a very well-regarded quarterback. We've never seen him play. Both of us are hesitant to judge a quarterback until we've actually seen him throw in a football game. If there's way too much anecdotal evidence that quarterbacks can't be judged until they play meaningful snaps. But all that said, my score that I had in my head for prediction is 51-17, so almost exactly on with yours. That's what I had written down.
And y'all, we didn't discuss this ahead of time.
No, and the it's almost exactly the same rationale you gave, which is kind of funny. That I think Louisville's going to take their shots deep. I think they're going to connect on some of those shots probably early. This game may not be that lopsided early. It may be like a 30-10, 30-10, 30-13 kind of what have you game going into halftime. The problem is that means Alabama has to keep their starters in. Then Alabama's going to try to keep scoring. At some point, the front seven for Alabama is going to take over. I agree with you that Alabama's depth defensively in their front seven is a really serious concern for their football team. If Alabama stays healthy, they're, I think, far and away the best team in terms of talent and probably overall in the country. But that depth issue that may really be an issue later in the season isn't going to show up right now. So their front seven should be able to take over at a certain point in the game. Like you noted, they've got two quarterbacks to try out. They're going to be facing a team in Petrino that usually tries to keep scoring, which means Alabama's going to have to keep scoring, and they're going to end up running that score up. And that's why I think it ends up being something like 51-17 in a game that isn't that lopsided at the half. Probably never feels like it was that lopsided. But because of the way Alabama's going to have to play it, and because of the fact that I think Petrino is going to keep pushing and force Alabama to continue to score to put the game away or to keep distancing themselves from an offense that they know can put up a lot of points, the final score gets pretty out of hand.
And Alabama played two teams last year that were defensively, scoring defense ranked around where Louisville was, and they were in the 40s on both of them, and they shut it down early. Louisville fans, you're going to be mad at us for this score, and just know that we don't predict blowouts every week. We generally do for Alabama games because they blow everybody out every week. It's not a slight to your team. We're actually giving you more points than Alabama. Alabama gave up 11-something per game last year. I think it was like 11.9 points per game. So we're actually giving you more points than they gave up almost all the entirety of last year. And we to our credit, were at some point, I think we were like 17-2 last year against the spread. And just if you didn't follow, our prediction for the national championship game was Alabama 25, Georgia 23. The final score was 26-23. We generally do pretty well, and we don't play the SEC homer thing very much. I mean, we pick SEC teams to lose all the time against non-SEC teams. We just think that the matchup is bad for Louisville, and that's how it's going to shake out. Give me, to sign this one off, give me your MVP real quick, offensive or defensive. MVP for Louisville in this game and MVP for Alabama.
So MVP for Alabama, I think it's going to be Tua Tagovailoa. I think he's going to come out and everybody's going to be, the media is going to go crazy because the guy can come out and he can throw a football at Alabama. And if that's the case, it's going to be interesting because we've talked about this a lot over the past few years. Going back to your point, Alabama won 11 of 14 games last year by multiple scores. And that's been pretty consistent. About 85% of their games, they win by multiple touchdowns. College football gets really unfair and uneven, and sometimes teams are just utterly dominant. Alabama has been that probably more times in a row than we've seen in a long time. And I think on paper, given the talent they have, if they stay healthy, they have a chance to be absolute runaway favorites the entirety of the year in a way that we haven't seen in a while, really, in college football. And that's all going to hinge off Tua Tagovailoa and what he's able to do. And then for Louisville, I think the MVP has to be Jawan Pass, because Louisville and their offense, just as a practical matter, it all hinges on the quarterback. So if Pass is having a bad day, then nobody's going to have a good day. And so it's pretty much him or bust. And, I think he has a decent day. But I will say that if he doesn't, it's going to be hard for anybody else to produce at a high level.
All right, last question. I would kick myself if I didn't ask you this, because I think it's an interesting one. If this Alabama, on a scale of 1 to 10, if this Alabama offense is a 10 in the Nick Saban era, if all the weapons that they have on this offense and the coaches that they got in the offseason, if this Alabama offense is a 10, what's the next closest number for the best offense? So the second best offense in the Alabama era, if this is a 10, what are they?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So what would be the second best offense that Alabama's had?
Related to this one.
Yeah, related to this one. Yeah, because I'm on record as saying the 2016 offense and the 2014 offense, as much as they scored point-wise, they had that spread offense problem where they were, in my opinion, very poorly. Their production was far exceeded what they were actually, the talent level was, or what they're able to do against elite teams. I think that showed statistically. The 2015 offense was good, but I don't know that it was great. 11 was kind of in the same boat. 2009 team that they had with Mark Ingram was a pretty consistent offense, and was actually quite powerful. And they didn't score a lot of points because they ran the clock out. But I think it really comes down to either 2010 or 2012. And I'll cheat and give you two answers. So 2012, the offense that they ran at the very, very end of the season, when Doug Nussmeier finally figured out that they should be a run-first offense and that Eddie Lacy, as it happens, was a really good running back, that second half of the Georgia game and the Notre Dame game, they ran a different style of offense, and that offense was the best of the Saban era. And if they had run that style of offense, meaning they were a run-first team and you had a vertical passing attack off it, that I think was far and away the best offense that Saban's had. It's just for their sake, it's a shame that they had an offensive coordinator that decided to throw the ball 4 times on a 1st and 4 against Texas A&M, and that lost to Johnny Manziel. And if you count the whole season, I think it has to be the 2010 team that had Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson and Eddie Lacy and Julio Jones all on the same squad, and a very good offensive line to boot. That offense wasn't very consistent, but it did score a lot of points. The defense gave up points off and on, and there were flashes like the 2010 win by Cam Newton where that offense darn near put up 31 points in the first half and put that game away. It was quite kind of out of sync at times for the same reason, but I would probably, on the season, I'd probably say the 2010 offense, and I'd rank them. I mean, they were 7.5 or an 8. I don't think any team under Saban really is close to the potential of what Alabama could be this year, because they could have the passing game that Oklahoma had last year, only paired with one of the best rushing attacks in college football, and have the kind of offense that maybe resembling what Spurrier assembled at Florida in the late 90s that was almost impossible to stop.